It's the end of another year, so time for another year in review reading wrap up. I'm counting 18 books this year and 13 comic books, and I'm going to talk about each one of them very briefly. We'll try and keep this fast paced. So the first book is The Peloponnesian War by Donald Kagan. Now, actually, technically, I finished this book off in 2022, but I reviewed it in 2023, and I always count my lists by when I get around to reviewing the book. The next one is The Odyssey by Homer. Another book that I actually read mostly in 2022. I did the last few pages of it on January 1st, 2023, and I reviewed it in 2023. I suppose I should say something briefly about each book, huh? Peloponnesian War was a little dry in places, but on the whole, I found it a fascinating history. The Odyssey, well, this is a classic of Western civilization. I'd forgotten how much of it was build up and how little of it was actually action, but it was still very interesting to go back and reread it. This was a reread, by the way. Storm Before the Storm by Mike Duncan, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. It's a history book, as the title suggests. It's the period right before the fall of the Roman Republic. I absolutely loved this book. I gave it 10 out of 10 stars on my blog. But then I'm a history nerd, and this is my favorite period in history, so of course I would love it. Take my opinion with a grain of salt. Dune by Frank Herbert. This is a book that I'm not sure I would have read were it not for BookTube and all the people on BookTube who have been praising this book. I gave it a little bit of a mixed review. I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. I definitely agree that there was a lot of interesting stuff going on here. I'm not sure how well it all came together. I ended up giving it 7 stars out of 10. I know a lot of people would rate it higher. I largely enjoyed it. Still somewhat trying to figure out what to make of it. Bulfinch's Mythology. This was a reread of sorts. I had done this as an audiobook years ago, so the first time actually physically reading it. This is one of those rereads where I remembered the original text well enough that it was, I'm not quite sure I needed to reread it, but I always like Greek and Roman mythology. It was fun to go back to it. Diagramming Sentences by Lynn Hess. I don't have a copy with me to show you because it was a library book. It's gotten returned to the library. In my review, I nitpicked a lot of what I perceived to be mistakes in the book, but I did largely enjoy it, and I found it useful to refresh my knowledge of diagramming sentences, and maybe I did enjoy it a little bit. Maybe I got into the fun of diagramming sentences again. The Linguistic Wars. So this is a reread. Kind of. I had read the first edition. This is my copy of the first edition. This was reading the second edition. I can't show you my copy of the second edition because after I finished reading it, I thought it would be very useful for other teachers at my school, and I donated it to my school library. So it's wasn't a library book to begin with, but it's a library book now. As with the first edition, I found it really fascinating in places, and then there are spots I didn't understand. But on the whole, I'd recommend it. And I think that the second edition has a lot of fascinating stuff that wasn't in the first edition. So the second edition is even more interesting. Although there, as I said in my review, there's some stuff in the first edition that didn't make it to the second edition. So you do gain stuff and you do lose stuff. For somebody who's not deep into linguistics, and I'm not, there were parts of it I didn't understand, but on the whole, I found it a very interesting read. How to Teach Listening by J.J. Wilson. I don't have a copy to show you because it's a library book, but found it very useful. Found it moderately useful, actually. Sorry, there are a handful of activities that I took from that book and which I still use now. I didn't get as many useful activities out of it as I wanted to. It's a book for professional development. I should have said that when I was introducing the book. Another book I read for work, although a little bit more general, is Getting Things Done by David Allen, who I think has a very useful system, which I've tried to implement and then I kind of dropped the ball on it a little bit. Part of his system is you need to review your to-do list weekly to make sure everything's organized in the right spot. And he said it's very important you make time for that no matter how busy you are. And I haven't been making time with that. I haven't been making time for that weekly review of my to-do list. So I know what I should be doing. I haven't kept up with it. One of my New Year's resolutions is to get organized and do the things in his system. So I think it will be a very useful book if I can just get around to implementing his system. Interesting ideas, though. All right, next, Harriet the Spy. Where's my copy here? This is a children's book, or at least a young adult's book. My edition is falling apart. I got this used to begin with, but I've already read it now, so I guess let it fall apart. It's a classic young adult's book, and it's easy to read because it's kids' book. I thought it lagged a little bit in the middle, and I thought its criticism of middle-class suburbia was a little bit heavy-handed and maybe snobby. But on the whole, pleasant and easy read. Wrinkle in Time, which I can't show you because I brought it back to the library book. This is another young adult kids book. It's something as I said in my review, have been meaning to read for ages. I had a 4th grade teacher who was very enamored with the whole series. I didn't really love it, but it was a pleasant and easy enough read. If I had access to more of the series, I would have kept reading in the series, but my school library only had that one book. Maybe at some point in the future I might try and come back to that series. Children's stories from old British and Irish legends. I found this book very pleasant and fun to read and was able to educate myself somewhat about British and Irish legends while reading this. How to Teach for Exams by Sally Burgess and Katie Head. This is another book for professional development. I found it moderately useful, but not super useful. A lot of it was stuff I already knew. The Thomas Cromwell trilogy, which I read the first 2 books of. Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, Bringing Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel. Wolf Hall was a library book. The other 2 books were not in my school library, but I was able to order them here in Vietnam. Finished Bringing Up the Bodies, still working on The Mirror and the Light. Getting there, but not quite done yet. So I'm feeling a little bit bogged down maybe at this point in the trilogy, and maybe that's going to color my perception of the first 2 books I read. But I know everybody else loves these books. I found them a little bit too much detail, a little bit too many descriptions, a little bit too much poetic description. No, I'm sure that's why more literary people than me actually love these books. Maybe I don't have the patience for them. That being said, though, I think my patience has been worn out with each subsequent book. So Wolf Hall I was largely on board with. Bring Up the Bodies somewhat less so. At this point, maybe I'm getting a little bit tired of Hilary Mantel's prose, but but I'm glad I'm reading it. Then Dracula. This was a reread, kind of. I had done it as an audiobook over 20 years ago, so this is my first time reading through it. And so now I have actually physically read Dracula, not only as an audiobook. Did this for the month of October for a Halloween read. Found some parts of it. It was largely how I remembered it. There were some great individual scenes which were really gothic and spooky. On the whole, though, I found it a little bit of a slog to get through all of it. But I'm glad I came back and reread it. Then one of my big reading projects this year, I think maybe the big reading project I did this year, was Journey to the West, the 16th century Chinese classic, which is absolutely huge. I read it in 4 volumes, the editions I have in my school library. I can't show them to you because I've given them back to my school library. But yeah, Volume 1 finished in February, Volume 2 finished it in June, Volume 3 finished it in August, and Volume 4 finished it in October. It's one of the 4 great Chinese classics, and I've been meaning to read the 4 great Chinese classics for ages, or at least some of them, one of them. So I'm glad I finally tackled this off my reading list. And it was a very enjoyable read for the most part. The caveat is it's episodic, it's repetitive, and it's very long. But on the other side, the individual stories can be a lot of fun, although they do get a little bit repetitive. And the world in which it takes place is very imaginative. Lots of it's a very interesting mythology, so I quite enjoyed it on the whole. And then my project to read through the Bible completely stalled out last year on Leviticus, and I let it go for over a year, which is I'm a little bit disappointed in myself, or maybe disappointed is a strong word, but if I'm going to make this, if I'm going to get through the Bible, I'm going to have to be more disciplined about it. But came back near the end of this year, in November and December, and read Leviticus in November and Deuteronomy in December. Genesis and Exodus I had read last year before I stalled out on my Reading the Bible project. So Leviticus and Numbers. Numbers is split between narrative and the laws, and also the census. Leviticus is almost all laws. They're not the most interesting parts of the Bible to get through. The historical narrative is what I consider the most interesting parts. But then there's a lot of the Bible that's not interesting. So this project is going to require some discipline. Then there are parts of the Bible which are very interesting, the historical narrative, and some of that was in Numbers. So onwards to Deuteronomy, and I've started Deuteronomy now, so we'll see how I do with this project in 2024, continuing through the books of the Bible. All right, and then now the comic books. Again, most of these are back in the school library, so I can't show them to you, but I do have some of them here in my room. In addition to the Odyssey, I read the Classics illustrated version of the Odyssey and reviewed that on this channel. I finally got around to something I've been meaning to do for years, is reading the Buddha series by Tezuka Osamu, all 8 volumes. So finished volume 1 on February 1st, volume 2 on February 2nd, volume 3 on February 3rd. The kids were gone that week. They were with the wife at the parents' house, so I was making good progress. Once the kids came back, the progress slowed a bit. I finally finished off volume 8 on April 11, 2023. I gave it a bit of a mixed review. I had been expecting more of a coherent story. Was a little bit disappointed to find out how episodic the whole thing was and how unplanned the character arcs were. but it was. I learned some interesting things with it. As I was going, I was looking stuff up on Wikipedia to see how much of it was true. More often than not, true meaning true to the original legend. More often than not, it wasn't true to the original legend. But cross-referencing with Wikipedia, just the fact that it made me go to Wikipedia to look stuff up, helped me learn stuff about the original legend of Buddha and his followers. Nightfall, Volume 1 of the Batman series, something I had read parts of in my youth, but never read through the whole thing, although it's just Volume 1. Yeah, at some point in the future, might want to try and track down Volumes 2 or 3. Captain America, Volume 1 from the Mighty Marvel Masterworks. This is the early Captain America from the early 1960s when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby brought him back. It's classic Marvel, but it's not aged well. And I know this is heresy to say this about Stan Lee's golden period, but I think those early Stan Lee books, as influential as they were for their time, do not hold up well today. They just read as very boring and talky. Diary of a Wimpy Kid, The Ugly Truth, which I got from my school library, and Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Roderick Rules, which I got up here. I got this one from a used bookstore, so I still have this one. Both books were largely forgettable, but incredibly entertaining. Even though the jokes are a little bit repetitive at this point, maybe entertaining is the wrong word. Fun to read. They keep you turning the pages. Marvel Horror Lives Again, a huge book, which again, another library book, so I can't show you here, but it was like this thick, some 1,200 something pages, which took me a while to work through. How long was I reading that book? Looks like second half of June, July, and August. So 2.5 months of varying quality, because it was a collection of different characters, but largely entertaining. Then I've got some books I have here in the apartment. Marvel Epic Collection, The Mighty Thor, War of the Gods. Now this one was great. This one was just everything a science fiction and fantasy comic book should be. Just a lot of fun 1970s Marvel sci-fi fantasy, mixing Norse mythology with science fiction. Great fun. The Incredible Hulk, again, part of Marvel's Epic Collection. This one wasn't quite as good, although it had its moments. It was an interesting idea, but flagged a little bit in execution. This is when the storyline when he's exiled at the crossroads. Superman Funeral for a Friend, which I can't show you because that's back at the library. That was a book that was a reread. I had read that back in the 90s when I was a teenager. And was pleasantly surprised when rereading it that parts of it were as good or better as I remembered. And what I mean by those parts is the subplots about Lex Luthor Jr. and his plans to take over the city, and the Cadmus cloning project and their plans to take over the city or to assert their influence, and the secret war that's going on between them in the background. I remember being intrigued by those subplots when I was a teenager, and came back to this to discover that those subplots are every bit as interesting as I remember them. The overarching story, though, about Superman being dead and everybody being sad that Superman is dead, that's not great, and not written well, and really kind of cheesy anyways, because Superman is, they killed him off and then they brought him back in 6 months. That whole thing was kind of dumb. But the plot lines going in the background, which then come to the foreground in the middle of the story, those I thought were quite interesting. And I thought at the time, and I think so now, that it's just a very good example of the writers kind of expertly keeping interesting plot lines bubbling in the background while other stuff is going on. Watchmen, this one's from the library, but I haven't gotten around to return it yet. This was a reread, the classic comic by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. I'm glad I reread it, refreshed it a bit in my memory, but I found it a little bit of a slog to reread this whole thing cover to cover in its entirety. It can drag on a little bit. Maybe that's because I was rereading it and I already knew the story. And then the follow-up to Watchmen, Doomsday Clock, which was entertaining to read even though there were huge plot holes in it. And I talked about some of those plot holes in my review. And then after Doomsday Clock, I just finished off just yesterday Aquaman War for the Throne, which is something I knew nothing about before I picked it up, but found it to be largely entertaining. Somewhat forgettable, but largely entertaining. Okay. And then my DNFs for this year, Teaching, Speaking, and Ting Viet 1, 2, 3. I'll put a list of everything I mentioned in the description down below, and link to a playlist of all the reviews I did from 2023. If you want to check out my thoughts on any of those books more in depth. But of those books, if you're looking for recommendations, I think the top 4 I would recommend are Peloponnesian War. What did I do with that? Over here. If you're interested in history, there are parts of some of the military parts of this book where it was just describing like the military maneuverings and the military tactics I found a little bit boring. But the overall portrait of Greek society and politics during this time I found very fascinating. If you're a history nerd, you'll love this book. And if you're a history nerd, you'll love this book, Storm Before the Storm by Mike Duncan. And if you're not a history nerd, sorry, I can only talk about what interests me on this channel, I guess. And the Linguistic Wars, which I already mentioned, there are parts of it I didn't understand, but I'm going to recommend that in spite of that. I'm holding the first edition here, but the edition I read this in 2023 was the second edition. There's enough interesting stuff in there about linguistics, philosophy, the way meaning is encoded in language, and how this understanding of it evolved during the 20th century, as well as the intellectual legacy of Noam Chomsky, that I think it should be of general interest to everybody who takes interest in any of those issues, even only tangentially. If you get to a part that you don't understand, just keep reading. Sooner or later, it will start to make sense again. That's what I did. And the book on the whole is worth it. There's enough interesting stuff in there that is worth it. And then my final recommendation from this reading list is Journey to the West, which is quite long. You may be just as happy with an abridged version, or you may be happier with an abridged version. I don't know if you need to read through every single last word in all 4 volumes, but it's an easy to read. It's like a 16th century Chinese classic, but in modern translation, it reads very smoothly. The action is fast paced. The story goes all over from magical islands up to the empire of heaven and the kingdoms of heaven, down into the underworld and all these magical lakes and rivers and oceans and caves. And it's just a very fun story, very easy to read. It's one of those classics that are fun to read. The unabridged version is quite long, but the story on the whole is fun. So those are my recommendations for 2023. If I were to pass on any recommendations to the BookTube community, and I will sign out here.